happy to introduce our first speaker this evening. My name is Michael Utzinger. I am the president of the Historical Society, and I'm very pleased that you all are here today. It is my pleasure to introduce John Majoris. I just found out, but I think this is very interesting. It happens with many of us who do history. He has a doctorate in French literature and French intellectual history from the University of Kansas. He was also a professor of French and international education at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and ultimately the dean of the College of Liberal Studies at UW-La Crosse as well. John was a volunteer doing archival work for the Racine County Historical Society. I did that for 5 years, and then ultimately was a volunteer archivist for the DeKoven Foundation. I think what's amazing when one walks into something that is new and finds a passion, John found that and made a mark and made a difference both for this place and for studies in the Episcopal Church, which is also, you are working on a biography of James DeKoven, and it says you're preparing, but I get a hint that maybe you're closer to done than not.
Very close.
Okay, great. With no further ado, John Majoris.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm very honored to be here this evening to share some information about a wonderful man named James DeKoven. But I'm also very happy to be here to be able to thank the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church in person for the funding of a grant that I was given in 2018 that allowed me to travel to Middletown, Connecticut, where DeKoven was born, and I spent 10 days researching there, his family, as well as his early years. I think this room is a wonderful place to start this talk, because this was the final building that DeKoven really helped organize, and it was called the schoolhouse, or the school room. And just, you have to imagine what it was, because in this room, there were 100 student desks in rows, 5 rows. I can't imagine what the noise level must have been when the boys got here. But the way that the school day was organized was they came in here for the start, and if you see those 2 doors in the very back, those 2 doors opened onto small classrooms, and then the middle door is a stairwell that goes up to the 2nd floor, and upstairs there were 4 classrooms, very small classrooms. So they had, and those were when the boys were called out to go to sessions with the different teachers. And so it was a constant movement. This is also where they assembled in the evening for their study halls. Like I say, it was the final building that James DeKoven supervised. When I started working at the DeKoven Center, I had no idea who James DeKoven was, not the least. And so I started reading, and I found out, he was well known for being a ritualist, for being a great orator, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I didn't find out anything about him being a human being. And I think that being a human being, being a good human being, is also being a good saint. And I think that's what I have learned over the years. On your table, there are handouts. That's me making all that noise. If you look on the side with print, if I have time, I'll talk about the pictures, but right now I'm going to talk about the print. Over the years, there have been very few biographies written of James DeKoven, and one of the problems is there are very few personal remarks about this man. The letters have almost all disappeared. We do have some of his letters that he wrote, and we do have some letters that people wrote to him. But the one source that really has provided a lot of information is a journal that he kept from 1862 to 1879 called The Story of a College. That was one journal. We do know that he kept a couple diaries, but those have disappeared. We also have a lot of his, we have almost 50 of his sermons, but those don't really give us an insight into what he was thinking and who he was. So this journal ended up, we found out, at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., in their archives, in their rare books collection. It has now been returned to Nashotah House, and I've read it so many times that I have prepared an index to it because I was using it so often I had to have an index. So a lot of the quotations that I'm going to talk about today come from that story of a college. Although he started writing it in 1862, it covers the period from his arrival in Wisconsin in 1854 and goes through his January of his last year. He died in March. So the last entry was in January the 2nd of 1879. This first quote that I have there is about the buildings, and it's about this one in particular. He says, "The beautiful dining hall, which was built by contributions of people in Chicago chiefly, was finished in autumn of 1871. And in the spring of 1872, we determined to build a new schoolroom, making the front of the quadrangle complete." So he had an idea of what he wanted it to look like. The interesting thing is he didn't go back to Chicago to raise funds. He provided the funding for this room. And the reason he didn't go back, what happened in 1871 in Chicago? The fire. He realized that people didn't have any money that they would be willing to help support the new school. He loved Racine College, and he loved the students. He traveled to Europe twice. In 1858, he traveled there with a good friend, George Franklin Seymour, who eventually became Bishop of Springfield. And Seymour later on wrote, he said, I knew that I was going to go on a trip with James DeKoven. They had been college roommates. But he said, I didn't know that we were taking along 25 boys. Because he said, every night, James DeKoven talked about the boys. He said, I ended up at the very end of the trip knowing more about those boys than I knew about my own friends. In 1868, he wrote this letter, and it's addressed to my dear boys. He's writing from the Grand Hotel in Paris. Meanwhile, each day, I think no sea prospect as beautiful as Lake Michigan, no town as fair in my eyes as Racine, no cathedral as noble as the chapel, no person so dear as my own dear boys. So good night to you all. Affectionately, James DeKoven. In 1858, he wrote a series of 12 letters that we do have, and they're like guides to, and he teaches, every one of them is like a lesson in what different money is used in different lands, what a passport is. And he makes comparisons between the boys that he sees. For example, he sees boys working in the print shop in London, making money, and he compares them in size to different boys that are in the school in Delafield at that point. So it's this personal contact that he had with the boys. One of the things that he emphasized, and he came from a very wealthy family, and one of the things, and an old family in Middletown, what he emphasized with the boys was manners and behavior. And he insisted that when he came across a group of boys, that he shook hands with all of them, and he talked to them, and he asked them questions, and they had to ask him questions. It wasn't just a one-way street. He wanted them to have manners. He wanted them to be gentlemen. And so, and every Sunday evening, well, not every Sunday evening, there was what was called the warden's reception. One Sunday, it was for the younger boys. The next Sunday, it was for the college boys. And then Then one time every week or every month, it was for the whole group. And then sometimes there was a reception for the citizens of Racine would come. He really involved the people of the city in his school. And so they really had a personal involvement because we know that they had raised the first money for the school. He became very attached to the students. And this is what the next quotation on this page is. And he says, "I was very sorry to bid goodbye to Miriam, dear fellow. He has been here for 6 years or more. That indeed is the trial of this kind of life. One learns to love the boys and young men as though they were one's children, and then they go away and come back but rarely, and other ties grow up with them, and then too other boys come to me, and so things change." So he's very well aware of the rolling on of life. Interesting, in part of the research that I've done, I have uncovered at least 7 different people, young men who graduated from Racine College, who eventually named a child DeKoven. Some of them are James DeKoven, and then a new last name. But so there was this way of honoring this man who had such an influence on them. And I think that's very, very fitting. This story here about Miriam, this was about a young man whose name was William Merriam. He went on to become the governor of Minnesota. And after he was governor of Minnesota, he was elected to the National Congress as a representative. And as is known in history, he's the one who organized the first very effective census in the United States. So he had influence. These people from this school were all over the place. One of the more interesting stories is a young man whose last name was Taft, who came from Ohio. And he didn't go into politics, but he went into horticulture, and he created the Taft avocado. He introduced the avocado to the United States in California. And the Taft avocado was a great avocado because it didn't turn brown when you cut into it. But it's not grown because it's not as prolific as the Haas avocado. Just one of those little tidbits of history that you learn. He loved Racine College and took pride in what had been built. He loved these buildings, and he was very romantic. He was a poet in many ways. Some of his sermons, I found one sermon that I have studied in depth, and it's almost like it was written by Walt Whitman because of his repetition. You know, and I thought of Walt Whitman immediately when I saw it. And he writes, "Today I left my study and walked about the college grounds. There had been a storm, and now the clouds had vanished, and the sun was shining brightly. The grass, which the drought had nearly withered, looked fresh and green again. The flowers in the window boxes were very bright." I'll tell you about the window boxes in a little bit. "The pleasant wind plays in the woodbine, which covers one side of the chapel and a part of Taylor Hall. Never did the chapel garden with its foliage bed and the tryst geraniums and verbena seem more lovely. The buildings, now all fresh and clean and ready for the term which is soon to open, were very noble to look upon. I thank God for it all." It's this when you enter into his real emotions. The window boxes. He was in Europe in '68. He saw window boxes in Switzerland, and he fell in love with them. So I wrote a letter to the college, the people who were administering it at that time, and he said, "I want you to start a competition to see who can get the best window box in one of the buildings." And so when he came back, the window boxes were up and the flowers were growing. And we have pictures of the window boxes. For many years, there were window boxes in the buildings. I really felt that I had made a contact with James DeKoven when I read this next excerpt. He was writing as if someone was going to read this, but he was really writing it for himself. And I'm a cat lover. So here we go. The term opened very pleasantly in the mild September weather. If my handwriting is bad, it is because of a cat who is purring and rubbing her head against my hand as I write. The creature even jumps at my pen. And this made me think immediately of Montaigne, who wrote almost exactly the same thing about a cat interfering with his writing. He doesn't say that he batted the cat away or that he chased the cat away, just as the cat was there. And so this, to me, is opened up some emotional feelings that he had. In 1875, he writes in September 5th, "The past year has been the saddest and most distressing year of my life, full of sorrow and care. But God's will is, I hope, my will in such matters." It had been such a depressing year. His mother had died in 1874. He had been elected, he had been refused election as bishop of the Wisconsin diocese. And then in February 5th, he had been elected bishop of Illinois, which was never validated by the standing committees. And Taylor Hall had burned down on the same day. So it had been a lot of tragedy. But at least he felt that he could say this and express his feelings in what he was writing. And I think as I've read through this journal time and time again, I really have this contact, this connection with a man who, in many ways, was alone. Towards the end of his life in 1875, after his mother had died in 1874, his sister Margaret came to live with him. And then a year later, their sister Elizabeth, their oldest sister, joined them. And he's very honest in some of his opinions about his family. He talks about Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a real adventuresome person. She had moved to Chicago in 1834 when DeKoven was 3 years old. By the way, his nickname in the family was Jamie. And I call him JDK, Jamie. And some of his nieces and nephews toward the end of his life referred to him as the bishop, even though he had never been, which was, I think, kind of nasty in some ways because he'd been turned down. But, you know, families have freedom that other people don't have about people. But anyway, so Jamie, JDK, the bishop. When the sisters took over and came in 1935, when they came here to establish the DeKoven Foundation for Church Work, they started having large conferences, people coming in and people saying, who was James DeKoven? And they didn't have very good handouts. So they started trying to write a biography. And there was one sister, Sister Mary Bianca, who was the sister in charge. They'd gone away with the idea of Sister Superior. Sister in charge, and she started writing letters all over the United States, trying to get someone to give her more information. And she had collected quite a bit of information. But one of the things that she did, when one of the letters that I found as I was going through letters, was a letter that she had written to William Manross, and I thought it was very appropriate, because of the lecture that Cheryl's going to be doing tonight, was he wrote back, and he, among other things, he said, "A full biography of DeKoven is much to be desired." So I'm hoping that we will eventually be able to fulfill that desire. If you turn to the back to look at the pictures, and these sort of accompany it, what we dealt with last night, the top one is probably an imaginary idea of what he hoped that this front quadrangle would look like. I think it's interesting that in the middle of it, the artist placed Sainte-Chapelle from Paris. It's an absolute reproduction of a Sainte-Chapelle. James DeKoven used this as the top of a stationery that he used when he wrote letters. And so but it was before the chapel, the actual chapel was built. Well, the letter that I have is from 1863. It never got built, but it did get completed. There's 240 feet between those two buildings, which you see going down, Park Hall on the right and Kemper Hall on the left. And these are the prior to the additions of the Great Hall in 1871 and 1872. So there obviously had been some idea what this place was going to look like when it was finished. When you go over Racine College in 1883, this is really, you see the active place that it was. I mean, you can see the barns towards the back of the buildings. They had cows, they had farmers. One year they raised 1,000 bushels of potatoes. When you have 250 boys eating 3 meals a day, you need a lot of potatoes. A little neater vision of the buildings in 1876. And on the bottom, the final column there, is this picture of James DeKoven with teachers and some of the older students. He's the one in the center. This is probably the healthiest picture that we have of him, because he had lots of health problems, but he was enjoying some of those potatoes too. But he was with his boys. He was always happy when he was with his boys, because he wanted this school and this place to be a family. So I hope this gives you a little bit more insight into him as an individual and as a person who really cared about what he was doing, and who did it to honor the honor of God and to the honor of education. He believed in education, and he was very happy when the boys succeeded. He followed up on students. He kept touch of students when they had gone on, and he always said, it wasn't whether they were successful, it wasn't whether they had a happy profession, it was whether they had continued to practice their faith. That was the most important thing for him. Thank you very much.